Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library. And I have a great story to tell you. Tonight, we are going to explore the world of gods, heroes, and monsters in the forests, in the fields, and the cold waters of the northern seas. The time has come to tell you about Norse mythology. There will be many stories, and we will bounce back and forth as I narrate the history of the gods, delve into cosmology, and discuss the myth of creation, along with many different aspects of Norse mythology. As always, you do not need to watch the video to follow along. If you wish to, you may close your eyes and forget about any worries as we embark on this adventure together. We now have a Patreon page for those of you who wish to and can support this project, get more of it, and listen ad-free on your favorite podcast app. Patreon is a platform that allows you to directly contribute to our work financially. If you join, you will get various new things like the possibility to listen to all episodes with or without background sounds, and regular bonus episodes. We already have 3 episodes available only to our Patreons, with the latest one being The Life of Frida Kahlo. You will be able to download all these audios, and you will have your say on the choices of topics, advance releases, and updates on upcoming episodes. We hope to see you there soon so that we may continue developing Lights Out Library, which we enjoy so much. You will find links in the description box and the first comment pinned under the video. If you fall asleep and wish to resume the video later or jump directly to a particular part of the story, timestamps are also listed in the description and pinned in the first comment, as well as links to different streaming options like Spotify, Apple Podcast, and Amazon Music, which may be better suited for you. But before we begin, assume a comfortable position. Take a long, deep, relaxing breath, and when you exhale, release the tension in your shoulders, your neck. Release the tension in your facial muscles too, and allow the sound of my voice to guide you through this journey. The first story is about the king of gods, Odin, and how he lost an eye. Odin was a ruler of the Aesir tribe of deities, a powerful clan that included Thor, Freyr, Loki, Balder, Heimdall, and many more. Their home was Asgard, one of the 9 worlds and the highest among these. This was because all worlds were located on the branches of the world tree, and Asgard was on the highest and sunniest branch. But Odin was different. He was not the archetypal almighty warrior who ruled by pure physical strength, like Thor. Odin was also an avid seeker of knowledge. He had a reputation for not always playing by the rules of honor or justice. Moreover, he was as engrossed in poetry and the quest for wisdom as he was in commanding triumph on the battlefields. He often left Asgard, wandering through the cosmos to pursue his goals. His thirst for knowledge and discovery was such that he was willing to sacrifice almost anything to attain them. This unquenchable quest led him to discover the secret of the runes. At the center of the cosmos was the great world tree, Yggdrasil, supporting the 9 worlds on its branches. Yggdrasil grew out of an infinitely deep pool, the Well of Urd. The mysterious depth of the pool held many of the most powerful beings and foreseers of the cosmos, so enigmatic and concealed that they were unknown to the gods of Asgard themselves. Among these beings were 3 maidens, the Norns, who created the fates of all beings. They shaped fates by carving magical symbols, the runes, into Yggdrasil's trunk. These intentions traveled throughout the tree by the power of these runes, reaching the world and individuals to whom they were destined. Everyone and everything in the 9 worlds, up to Asgard atop the tree, were affected by the power of the Norns and their runes. From his throne, Odin observed the 3 maidens, and his desire to acquire their power and wisdom grew stronger each day. He became obsessed that no sacrifice seemed too large to accomplish his task. However, the runes did not reveal themselves to anyone but those who were worthy of seeing them, those who had proven their absence of fear. Odin could not see him. He had to prove his worth. He hung himself from a branch of Yggdrasil, pierced himself with his spear, and from this terribly precarious position, he scanned the dark waters below him. He forbade any other god from helping him. Accepting aid would have invalidated his attempt to show willingness for self-sacrifice and fearlessness on his quest to discover the runes. He stared and stared into the waters, lingering on the edge that separates the living from the dead. After 1 day, he still hadn't seen the runes. Another day passed, then several more, and the runes still refused to reveal themselves. However, at the end of the 9th day, as his last forces were vanishing without bending his will, he began to perceive shapes in the depths of the pool. The runes had finally accepted the proof of his fearlessness. They had accepted his sacrifice, and they began to show themselves to him. They did not only reveal their shape, but also let him see and learn the secrets that lay within them. Beyond their physical form, Odin quickly fixed this new knowledge in his limitless memory, ending his ordeal by climbing the rope he had used to hang himself. He could then return to Asgard and heal his wounds. Odin had now acquired the power of the runes, which turned him into one of the mightiest beings in the universe. He enjoyed this, for his thirst for power was as great as his curiosity for knowledge. Armed with the knowledge of the runes, he could now protect himself and his allies in battle, awaken the dead, render his enemies' weapons useless, magically extinguish fires, and heal any wound, physical or emotional. Odin was satisfied, but he never had quite enough. On another occasion, he demonstrated his readiness to sacrifice himself to acquire knowledge. At the base of Yggdrasil, amidst the roots of the World Tree, lived an exceptionally wise being named Mimir, who occasionally advised the gods. Mimir's knowledge of all things was unparalleled, outstripping even Odin himself. This comprehensive understanding was achieved by drinking water from a well. The source of this water was the well of Erd, from which Yggdrasil itself grew. This was also where Odin saw the runes for the first time. Thus, this was no ordinary water. It contained all cosmic knowledge that could be absorbed by those who drank it. Intent on obtaining a drink of this miraculous water, Odin climbed down from Asgard, descending all the way to the roots of the tree. However, Mimir, fully aware of the value of even a few droplets of this sacred water, refused Odin's request unless he agreed to sacrifice one of his eyes in return. It was one thing for Odin to risk his life to discover the runes, but acceptance of the certain loss of an eye against the mere promise of extended knowledge was another commitment. Yet Odin valued the pursuit of knowledge over his physical integrity and consented to the sacrifice. He gouged out one of his eyes and dropped it into the well. Mimir upheld his promise, dipping a horn into the well and offering Odin a sip of its water. Thus, from that moment on, Odin, the god of war, came to be known as the one-eyed god. Contrary to what some might expect, he did not lose his eye on the battlefield or during a heroic fight against a monster, but sacrificed it to acquire something he deemed much more precious: wisdom and knowledge. As you know, mythological tales are always open to interpretation, and there can be many interpretations because these tales often exist in multiple versions with alterations. Apart from the simple pleasure of storytelling and their religious significance, myths always serve as a reference in the cultures where they appear. They can be cautionary tales or explanations about the origins of the world and why it exists as it does. They also have a political dimension. However, one problem with Norse mythology is that there is not an abundance of documents or texts to refer to. This is quite contrary to other ancient cultures like China, India, ancient Egypt, or Greece. In contrast, Norse mythology is principally known through medieval texts. The most important ones are called the Eddas. We will return to them later. Apart from texts, there are remains of oral traditions and archaeology. All the important texts, however, were compiled in the last generations when Scandinavia and Iceland were in the process of converting to Christianity. The old religion, the old cosmology, and all the beliefs that came with it were in the process of disappearing. The texts are from these last generations, or even from a time after the massive conversion to Christianity. But before we take a look at these sources, their historical significance, and the people who developed these myths, the branch of Germanic peoples, the Vikings, I am going to tell you about these 9 realms that were said to be supported by Yggdrasil, the World Tree. There is a lot to tell and a lot of things to discuss. So before we begin our exploration of the 9 worlds, make sure you are comfortable so we can truly dive into the exploration of the 9 worlds. We've already talked about Asgard, the land of the Aesir gods. There were other gods as well, the Vanir, who once were at war with the Aesir. I will narrate that story later. These 9 worlds were not easily accessible. They were generally invisible. Only secret doors led to them. Only the world of humanity, Midgard, was visible. However, the 8 other worlds could at times intersect with the visible world. For instance, Jotunheim, the world of the giants, could overlap with the wilderness in our world, or Hell, spelled with one L, the underworld, could connect via graves, or Asgard could align with the sky. The number 9 recurs significantly in Norse mythology as well as in other Germanic peoples' myths, which were closely related. It is unclear why this is the case. It could be due to the lunar calendar having 27 days, a multiple of 9, but there is no definitive explanation for their fascination with this number. The depiction of the world's positions at different levels around the trunk of the world tree is purely speculative. There are modern interpretations. Nothing in the sources suggests these 9 worlds physically placed around a huge tree on branches. It could have been metaphorical or even symbolic, as it doesn't really align with the concept of the overlaps between them. When Asgard is described as located in the sky, it is likely more spiritual or symbolic than physical. Asgard is first and foremost the land, the enclosure of the Aesir gods, the most famous and likely the most important deities for the Vikings in their daily life. They were the ones admired as exemplars and worshipped for various favors, much like God. These deities were often presented as models of order and civilization. Ancient Germanic peoples upheld the concept of Innangard and Utangard. Innangard signified the orderly, law-abiding, and stable elements hidden literally inside the fence. In contrast, Utangard represented what lay outside or beyond the fence and was characterized as wild and chaotic. These concepts were applicable not just to geography or these mythical worlds, they also held relevance to the psyche, the thoughts, and to actions. Things could either be Innangard, hidden and well thought out, rational and justified, or Utangard, disorderly and anarchic. Asgard symbolized the Innangard, the model of orderly perfection. In another world, Jotunheim, the homeland of the giants, was the exact opposite, a model of Utangard, filled with chaos and unpredictability. Between the two, somewhere in the middle, with elements of both law and civilization, but also chaos and wilderness, stood our world, Midgard, known as the Middle Enclosure or the Middle Land. However, before we delve into Midgard, let's recount a story about how Asgard was fortified. Once upon a time, the palace of the Aesir gods was defenseless in Asgard, which was a grave concern for Odin. One day, a builder arrived at Asgard and offered to construct a high wall that would protect them against even formidable enemies. The builder claimed that he could complete the task rapidly, in only 3 seasons. The gods, lacking alternatives, listened as he demanded an exorbitant price. His payment would be the delightful goddess Freya, the goddess of love and beauty, plus the sun and the moon. While it was within Odin's powers to deliver these three, he had to decide if the price was worth it. The gods advised amongst themselves. Freya immediately opposed the terms, as her fate was at stake. But the gods desired the protection of the wall. They thought there would always be time to renegotiate the terms later, and Loki hatched a plan. Loki suggested that the builder's desires be granted, but only if he could complete his work in a single winter instead of 3 seasons, and he could only have the assistance from his horse. While the gods were reluctant to give away the sun, the moon, and especially Freya, they agreed to the plan, suspecting the builder couldn't construct the wall quickly enough, hence avoiding the payment. The builder agreed to the new terms on the condition that all the gods swore an oath to keep their promise, and so the work started. At first, the gods marveled at the speed and quality of work. The horse tirelessly hauled enormous boulders over huge distances, and the builder skillfully constructed the wall around the clock. However, as winter progressed, their marvel turned to concern. With only 3 days left before the end of winter, only the stones around the gate were left to be placed. The looming possibility of succeeding caused the gods to fear, and their anger turned towards Loki, who was threatened with responsibility for the loss of the sun and the moon, which could lead to eternal darkness and the delightful Freya, who would have to be the builder's bride. Consequently, Loki, known for being the god of mischief and trickery, promised to find a solution in order to save his life. Devising another plan, Loki transformed into Ymir. When the builder's horse went to fetch more stones, Loki appeared. Distracted by Loki's disguise, the horse forgot about the stones and chased after Loki all night. By morning, the horse was nowhere to be found. The builder quickly realized that without his horse, he would fail to meet the deadline, which delighted the gods. The gods switched their anger to the builder, who got so close to acquiring the sun, moon, and Freya herself. For his audacity, he received a fatal blow from Thor's hammer. However, the gods weren't the only victors in this tale. In a distant forest, the builder's horse had caught up with Loki, leading to an unexpected outcome: the birth of Sleipnir, an 8-legged horse who would eventually serve as Odin's mount. Now, let's resume our exploration of the 9 worlds and discuss Midgard. Midgard was created by the gods after slaying a giant named Ymir. They fashioned various parts of the world from his body parts, even constructed a fence from Ymir's eyebrows. It might sound rather bizarre, with the proportions quite astonishing in many Norse myths. However, they weren't the only ones. In Greek mythology, for instance, one anecdote suggests that all the stars we see at night, the entire Milky Way, were actually the result of breast milk spilled by the goddess Hera while she was nursing the young Hercules. This doesn't seem very realistic either. The Norse myth of creation, as we shall explore later, was not concerned with realism or accurate proportions. This didn't really matter because it was a myth. These were forms of poetry. They carried metaphorical or symbolic functions. The intent was not to depict realism. Moreover, the Vikings' perspective of their world and society was quite different from the Western European perception of them during the Middle Ages. They were often seen as uncivilized warriors and looters. The ancestors of the Vikings had generally kept their distance from the Roman Empire. While there was mutual awareness, Scandinavia was far too remote for the Romans to consider conquest. Besides, they already struggled to contain the Germans. The Vikings were never a unified kingdom. Rather, they were a collection of tribes, clans, and smaller kingdoms that formed an ethnic and cultural area in what is now recognized as Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Iceland. They only truly made their presence known on the European scene in the 8th century, primarily through violent and unpredicted raids on towns, monasteries, and ships they could plunder. In Western European chronicles and subsequently historiography, the Vikings were depicted as barbarians, violent and uncivilized primarily because they were pagans who often attacked Christianized regions. However, reducing the Vikings to just warriors overlooks their roles as traders and explorers. Viking explorers ventured well beyond Western Europe. Those from Sweden set their sights on Russia and traveled as far south as the Byzantine Empire. They crossed the Atlantic and even reached North Africa via raids. Their society practiced agriculture and exhibited all the hallmarks of civilization. There was an established order, sedentary settlements, and an intricate societal structure underpinned by rules, traditions, and laws. The Vikings were far from chaotic. Their mythology, particularly the concept of Midgard as an intermediate world inhabited by humans, reflects this perception of their society. Midgard, located between the contrasting poles of order and chaos, was under the protection of gods and was a call to become increasingly civilized and orderly. This concept demonstrates their understanding that the model for human societies was one resembling order and stability, much like Asgard. Even though the wildness and chaos symbolized by Jotunheim were recognized as part of their world, the Vikings aspired towards a more organized existence, rejecting the intrinsic imperfections associated with disorder and tumult. So, Jotunheim was the third world, and it was located around Midgard. This fact was not made explicit. Jotunheim was described as an inhospitable expanse, blanketed with dark forests and towering mountain peaks, eternally gripped by winter only wild beasts could endure. Yet Jotunheim was also home to the giants. Giant is a translation of the term Jotun, and one that can be misleading because giant in English evokes a being of enormous size, but that was not the true nature of the Jotun. The Old Norse word Jotun is derived of Proto-Germanic, which means devourer. Thus, to the ancient Norse, There was no connotation of massive size in the term Jotun, similar to the Titans of Greek mythology. The giants of Norse mythology were powerful creatures, adversarial to the gods. As I previously mentioned, there are concepts of Innengard, denoting that which is orderly and law-abiding, and Utangard, denoting that which is chaotic and wild. The giants personified Utangard. The Aesir gods from Asgard were the protectors of civilization. Despite their personal flaws, which were numerous, they strove to uplift humanity, encourage societies to strive for greater prosperity, order, and culture. Contrastingly, the Devourers, or the Jotun, worked tirelessly to drag humans back into the primordial chaos. They represented forces of destruction and decay. The opposition between the Aesir gods and the giants, also known as the Jotun, is not one of God versus evil. Instead, it represents order versus chaos, or civilization versus wilderness. This dichotomy is a significant distinction between ancient pantheons and later monotheistic religions or traditions. In monotheistic religions, a single God is almighty, the creator of the world and its inhabitants, and perfectly good. Conversely, the devil is the incarnation of evil. Gods from ancient pantheons were neither as powerful nor as perfect. They did not create the cosmos, they were created with it. Even though they were eternal and incomparably more powerful than humans, their power was limited. They did not know everything. They were prone to conflicts and mistakes, had distinct personalities, and sometimes even their rule was not eternal. We will see that later with Ragnarok at the end. Specifically in the Norse pantheon, the giants were not intrinsically evil. They just followed their destructive nature. Occasionally, they could even play a useful role, albeit inadvertently. The Aesir and the giants were not entirely different creatures. Odin was half giant. Moreover, the gods did not seek to destroy the giants, but rather to keep them in check so that the balance would be preserved. So let's continue exploring the 9 worlds after these 3: Asgard, Midgard, and Jotunheim. The 4th world was Vanaheim, the home of another tribe of deities, the Vanir. These gods are like a lost continent of Norse mythology because the sources are very fragmented, so we don't precisely know what their importance was to the Norse. Some of these gods may have been among the most widely worshipped across the Viking world, but to us they seem eclipsed by the Aesir gods. There is no known description of Vanaheim either. It is vaguely pictured as a place wilder than Asgard, where the forces of nature dominate. Yet this does not provide a precise version of how the Norse perceived this world. Among the famous Vanir gods are 3 better-known figures. They joined the Aesir in Asgard after a war between the 2 tribes. These figures are Njord, the god associated with wealth and seafaring, who appears to have been well known and venerated by the Vikings. His daughter, Freya, who we discussed in a previous story, and his son, Freyr, also became honorary members of the Aesir tribe. Freya was famous for her fondness for love, beauty, and fine material possessions. If we were to compare her with figures from other pantheons, she would be closest to Venus in terms of the Romans and Aphrodite for the Greeks. It is widely believed that Freya and another goddess, Frigg, Odin's wife, were actually the same figures for most of Norse history. In later sources from the Middle Ages, they are distinguished as two different goddesses, but they share so many similarities that it could just be a misunderstanding by the authors who preserved Norse mythology in writing after the Christianization of Scandinavia. Their storylines and personalities seem similar enough to consider them the same deity. The third Vanir to join the Aesir was Freya's brother, Freyr, another divinity that was widely venerated and well liked because he was associated with peace, good health, and fertility, both agricultural for harvests and sexual. His blessing was called upon for weddings and in the celebration of harvests. But why did Njord and his two children end up in Asgard and become honorary Aesir gods? It was because they were taken as hostages after the war. But this is another story I must tell you. The war between the Aesir and the Vanir. When our story began, Freya was still living with her tribe, the Vanir, and she was the most powerful practitioner of magic in all the 9 worlds. She practiced Sadir, a form of magic that gave her the power to discern the course of fate, and also to work on the structure of fate to bring about change. In other words, Freya could interfere in destinies, and her services were passionately sought after. And so she traveled from town to town and from world to world, where people would hire her for her craft. She eventually visited Asgard, the home of the Aesir, and the Aesir gods were impressed with her talent and sought her services. In fact, they were so enthralled that this soon became almost an obsession for them. Their selfish desires were what they wished to fulfill with the help of the magician, becoming more important than anything else. The rules of honor, loyalty, and obedience to the law that characterized the Aesir were pushed aside. Realizing this, they didn't blame themselves for their shortcomings. This was not their way of dealing with problems. Instead, they blamed Freya. They conspired to murder her and return to their previous life once she was gone. 3 times they tried to burn her, but she was a powerful goddess too, and 3 times she was reborn from the ashes. When the Vanir learned what had been done, or at least what had been attempted, against one of their own, they became hostile to the Aesir. Soon the hostility between the 2 tribes erupted into war. The Aesir used physical strength and observed combat rules, while the Vanir relied on magic, which was their way. The war remained undecisive for a long time, with each side gaining the upper hand in turns. Neither the magic of the Vanir, or the strength of Thor, nor the tricks of Odin and Loki could put an end to it. Eventually, the 2 tribes had had enough of this fighting and agreed to call a truce. This is when they exchanged hostages, who would live with the other tribe as guarantee of peace, customary practice between tribes that had been at war. Njord and his children, Freya and Freyr, joined the Aesir, while the Vanir welcomed two members of the Aesir, Hoenir and Mimir. Hoenir was a god of great strength. He presided over a frenzy on the battlefields, but was considered of limited intelligence, as he often found himself at a loss for words. The other hostage, Mimir, had gained incomparable wisdom thanks to the magic water and had previously been visited by Odin, who offered an eye to broaden his knowledge. The Vanir were well versed in the magic arts, but this didn't necessarily mean they were smart. They observed that Hoenir could provide advice of extraordinary wisdom and value, so they began to regularly ask for his insight on everything. Unbeknownst to them, however, Hoenir was only visionary and articulate in the presence of Mimir, the real source of wisdom. As the time passed, they kept asking Hoenir for advice on issues, but without the company of Mimir, he often gave pointless and unhelpful answers. The Vanir grew angry at his perceived stupidity and felt cheated in the exchange of hostages. As retribution, they beheaded Mimir, the very source of wisdom they could have used to their advantage, and sent his head back to Asgard. Odin was quite saddened by the loss of his old friend, but this did not restart the war. Instead, Odin embalmed the head and revived it with a magic spell, allowing the preserved head of Mimir to continue giving him advice in times of need. Now let's return to our exploration of the 9 worlds, with a focus on the 5th and 6th ones. Niflheim, the world of fog, ice, and darkness, and Muspelheim, the world of fire and heat. These two were cosmological opposites and played an important role in the creation of our world and all living beings. This tale leads us to another story, the birth of the giant Ymir, the ancestor of all the giants and also the gods. So how did it all begin? Before any living creatures existed, or even plants, soil, or the sky, there was a gaping abyss, an expanse of darkness and void that existed between Niflheim, the homeland of ice, and Muspelheim, the homeland of fire. This state lasted for eons when no one existed, but gradually, over vast amounts of time, the frost from Niflheim and the flames from Muspelheim crept even closer, eventually meeting in the middle of the abyss. The meeting of these elemental principles set the creation of the world in motion. The fire melted the ice, and the drops combined into Ymir, the first giant. Ymir was a gigantic creature and was hermaphrodite, capable of reproducing without a mate. When he slept in the void of the abyss, the first resident of this vast emptiness, other giants appeared, all born from Ymir's body. As the frost continued to melt, a second creature was born from the drops, a cow. She nourished Ymir with her milk and nourished herself by licking the ice, which contained salt. As she licked, she slowly uncovered another creature who was a prisoner of the ice, Buri, Odin's grandfather and the first of the Aesir gods. Buri had a son who married a female giant, a daughter of Ymir, the primordial giant. Together they had 3 children, Odin and his 2 half-brothers, all half giant and half god. Odin and his brothers slew Ymir, and from his corpse they constructed the world. They formed the oceans from his blood, the soil from his skin, vegetation from his hair, and the sky from his skull. And this new era saw its first spring. Sometime later, the gods formed the first man and the first woman from tree trunks, marking the beginnings of humanity. But many other giants had come into existence from Ymir's body before he had been slain, and these giants had multiplied, their chaotic nature threatening to destroy the new world, Midgard. To protect it, the gods built a fence around it, using Ymir's eyebrows, so that this new world would thrive, at least for now, because everything that begins needs to end, and the end of times will eventually happen. We will delve into that later. So we have examined 6 worlds at this point: Asgard, Midgard, Jotunheim, Vanaheim, Niflheim, and Muspelheim. 3 worlds still remain unexplored. 2 of these were home to extraordinary creatures. Alfheim, the world inhabited by the elves. The elves, demigod-like beings, were luminous and more beautiful than the sun itself. There are no known descriptions of their homeland, but one could imagine it as a place filled with light and beauty. Alfheim contrasted with Niflheim or Svartalfheim, the subterranean world of the dwarves. As much as the elves lived above ground in luminous places, the dwarves were mastersmiths and craftsmen, and lived beneath the ground in an intricate system of mines and forges. And finally, the 9th world, the underworld, was known as Hel or Helheim, the realm presided over by the fierce goddess Hel. This location was considered subterranean, akin to graves. However, the name and locale should not lead us to perceive it as a place of torment, akin to Christian concept of hell. The similarity in names, Hell, H-E-L, and the modern English word, hell, is not coincidental. Both share a root in the Proto-Germanic language, an ancestor of Old Norse and Old English. The original intention of the word was believed to mean hidden or concealed, alluding to the underworld. It seems possible that when Christian missionaries brought Christianity to the Anglo-Saxons, they used the closest Old English approximation to describe Satan's realm. The term subsequently came to mean Christian hell in English. Despite the similarity in name, the nature of these 2 worlds varied noticeably. In Norse religion, hell was not a word where individuals were sent to as a post-mortem punishment. Instead, it was neutrally described as a place where one continues their existence after death, engaging in everyday activities such as eating, drinking, sleeping, and fighting. All of these worlds, their functions, their locations, their histories, feature in the various sources that give us access to Norse mythology. Nevertheless, these sources may conflict as they originate from different locations and periods. Like all mythology, Norse mythology was not fixed. It evolved over time. Considering the sources available, several are most complete and central to our modern understanding. These are texts from Iceland, specifically the Eddas. First, there is the Poetic Edda, a collection of poems precious for their systematic presentation of Old Norse cosmology and mythology. The authors are unknown, and the period is uncertain, but they likely originated between the 10th and the 13th centuries, when Scandinavia and Iceland were undergoing Christianization, but Old Norse beliefs persisted. Another primary source is the Prose Edda, a 13th century treatise written by the Icelandic scholar Snorri Sturluson. Although rich with information, it is post-Christian, and many scholars believe its interpretations and tales contain traces of the prevailing New World Order. Several historic texts, the sagas, also existed from medieval Iceland. These narratives interweave factual events with legends and mythological references, offering further insight. Other documents include medieval compilations of stories from Denmark and Germany, such as the Nibelungenlied. Sometimes old Anglo-Saxon literature, like the epic poem of Beowulf, assists in corroborating other sources. Beyond literature, archaeology provides an essential non-textual source. Archaeological findings do not narrate stories themselves, but they support the texts with their iconography and the ancient naming of places. I have already told you about several gods of the Norse pantheon: Odin, his wife Freya, also known as Frigg, and her brother Freyr. Now let's examine some other prominent Norse gods. Understandably, there are dozens of characters and numerous tales I could share, which means I had to omit several potential stories this time. You are already familiar with another famous Norse god, Thor. Thor epitomized the archetype of the warrior god, representing the ideal figure towards which human warriors should aspire. He was courageous, with a strong sense of duty and immense power. Aided by his magic belt of strength and mighty hammer, in countless episodes, Thor combats the Jotun, the giants. He serves as the defender of Asgard and a protector of humanity, often confronting various monsters. Of particular note is his fierce battle with an enormous sea serpent called Jormungand, so large that it surrounds Midgard. Interestingly, while Thor acted as the primary defense against the Jotun, his lineage was three-quarters Jotun. His father, Odin, was half Jotun, and his mother was of full giant ancestry. Another notable god is Loki, a character often associated with ambiguity. His father was a giant, not a god, and Loki is most renowned for his tricks and disregard for the well-being of other gods. Frequently depicted as a villain, He had little consideration for societal norms or reputation. He was more focused on self-preservation and was frequently characterized as a coward. The few instances where he was useful, for example, in the story about the wall of Asgard, he was compelled to contribute. Loki could also defy what we might call the laws of nature. He fathered monsters such as Jormungand, Thor's giant serpent enemy, and became a mother when he transformed into a mare. At the end of times, Ragnarok, that I have kept for the end of the story, he betrayed the gods, siding with the giants. So, in a sense, he is considered a god. He lives in Asgard, interacts with the gods, and wields significant power. However, he embodies the antithesis of traditional Norse values, as he lacks honor, honesty, and courage. Hence, there are no historical records indicating any worship of Loki. People who lived on the fringes of society, regarded as tricksters or viewing themselves as more intelligent than average, would have sought the patronage of Odin, not Loki, as his characteristics were far from desirable. There are even more figures to discuss. Baldur, the handsome and cheerful god who was loved by all creatures, parallels the northern Apollo. Heimdall, assigned to guard Asgard's stronghold, resided in a dwelling atop the Bifrost, a rainbow bridge connecting to Asgard. Tyr, another war god, presided over matters of law and justice. Many others play obscure roles due to sparse sources such as Idun, Bragi, and Sif. Various prominent giants also figure in these tales, though individual narratives provide names and details about some of them. It is important to remember that this vibrant and mysterious world is full of magic, and creatures embody every conceivable concept and emotion. Oddly enough, this world, born from the meeting of fire and ice at the dawn of time, was fated to disappear. And now, it is time for the last story of the night. Ragnarok, a tale from Old Norse mythology, refers to the fate of the gods, the cataclysmic destruction of the cosmos and everything within it, including gods, giants, the different worlds, and their inhabitants. This is the last possible tale of Norse mythology. But to the Vikings, it was more than a story, it was a prophecy, a disaster waiting to happen. Even though this precise narrative was already written. So, I'll tell it in the future tense. The Norns, the three maidens we previously discussed who influence the fates of both gods and humans, one day will decree that a great winter shall come. The sun's light and warmth will fade, completely plunging the world into an unprecedented darkness and extreme cold. Biting winds and snowstorms will soon add to this devastation. The terrible winter will last the equivalent of 3 winters without respite. During this grueling period, plant life will die, crops fail, and animals in the forests and the seas will also die in large numbers. As food becomes increasingly scarce, mankind will be driven to desperation, leading to the collapse of laws and codes of conduct, and a cruel and hopeless struggle for survival will endure. An age of wars, a time when tribes fall to chaos, brothers kill brothers and fathers kill their sons, will begin. In the skies, the sun, the moon, and the stars will disappear completely, leaving only a dark void above the survivors. At this time, monsters such as the monstrous wolf Fenrir and Jormungander, the giant serpent, will awaken and break free. The serpent's convulsions will spew ocean waters over the land. Floating on these cataclysmic floods, a sinister ship carrying an army of giants led by Loki, the traitor god, will navigate. The ominous dome of the sky forged millennia ago from the skull of the primordial giant Ymir will split apart. Fire giants from Muspelheim will emerge from the crack and advance toward Asgard, striding across the Bifrost, the rainbow bridge that connects Asgard to Midgard. Heimdall, the guardian, will blow his horn, heralding the moment all gods have feared for their existence. Despite the gods knowing that everything is lost and that this battle will be their last, they decide to make their stand against the giants and monsters, choosing to die with honor. Odin, joined by the champion of men's, an army of heroes chosen over the centuries for their bravery and their strength, will confront the giant wolf Fenrir. Together they will fight more valiantly than any god or man could have imagined, only to be defeated and consumed by Fenrir. Odin's only surviving son, filled with righteous fury, will manage to avenge his father by killing Fenrir. Subsequently, various duels lead to mutual destruction. The god Tyr will slay another monster wolf, only to be killed by it in the process. Heimdall will face Loki, and both will fail. So will Freyr and the chief of the fire giant, and Thor and the serpent, leaving no one alive on the battlefield. Finally, when all the gods and Jotun have perished, the remains of the world will sink into the sea. The water will cover everything and eventually dissipate, leaving only emptiness. Creation and all that happened since will be completely undone, as if nothing had ever occurred. Some say another world will arise after the waters recede, or it may be repopulated by a few survivors. Alternatively, if the void replaces everything, the frost from Niflheim and the flames from Muspelheim may collide, signifying the start of a new existence. We have now reached the end of our stories for tonight. I hope you enjoyed them, and I invite you to discover and learn more. You can now let go and sleep, or you may look for another story in my library. And until we meet again, good night. Sleep well.